There are two histories for every great tragedy. The one written for the public, for the newspapers, for the history books. And the real one. The one buried in locked filing cabinets, in burned memos, and in the quiet shame of men who took the truth to their graves. This is the real history of Pearl Harbor. It is not the story of a surprise attack. It is the story of a betrayal. A betrayal that began not in Tokyo, but in Washington, D.C. And it is the story of the man they chose to destroy to keep that betrayal secret. Admiral husband Edward Kimmel. For 80 years, his name has been a synonym for failure. Kimmel of Pearl Harbor. They said he was asleep. They said he was negligent. They said he was blind. But what if I told you Admiral Kimmel saw the danger more clearly than anyone in Washington? What if I told you he begged for the tools to prevent the attack and was denied? And what if I told you that the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, knew war was coming on December 6, 1941, went to bed, and left Admiral Kimmel completely in the dark? This is not a theory. This is evidence. This is the trail of declassified documents, the sworn testimony of intelligence officers, and the 80-year crusade of a family torn apart by their own flag. This is the story of the Pearl Harbor cover-up. To see how the perfect scapegoat was chosen, you have to understand the man. Husband Kimmel was a Navy man to his bones. Born in 1882, he graduated from the Naval Academy and lived by its code. He was strict, meticulous, and fiercely dedicated. He wasn't a politician or a showman. He was an operator, a man who believed in the chain of command, in duty, and in a simple equation. If you give a man a job, you give him the tools to do it. In February 1941, he was given the biggest job of his life, Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Pacific Fleet. The title was grand. The reality was a trap. He was handed command of America's premier fleet, based at Pearl Harbor, with a mission to deter Japanese aggression in the Pacific. But from the moment he arrived, Kimmel saw the problems with glaring clarity. Pearl Harbor was a defensive nightmare, a narrow, shallow entrance that could be easily blocked. The fleet was crammed into a single, vulnerable base. His resources were a joke. He immediately began firing off requests to Washington. He needed long-range patrol aircraft to scout the vast emptiness of the North Pacific from where an attack might come. He was given a handful of obsolete planes. He begged for more anti-aircraft guns, more ammunition, more support. The responses were always the same: delays, reductions, or outright denials. The official line was that material was needed for the Atlantic Fleet and to support Britain in its fight against Hitler. Kimmel was told, in essence, to make do, to be a team player. But Kimmel's paranoia was specific and logical. His greatest fear was not a carrier-based air attack from the north, a possibility considered so logistically insane that many in Washington dismissed it. His fear was sabotage. He believed Japanese spies and sympathizers in Hawaii would try to blow up the ships at their docks. To counter this, he issued a fateful order. He clustered his most valuable assets, the battleships of the Pacific Fleet, side by side along what was called Battleship Row. This made them easier to guard against saboteurs. But it also made them the perfect, stationary target for a different kind of attack. It was a rational decision based on the flawed intelligence he was given. He was preparing for the war Washington told him to expect, not the one they secretly knew was coming. Because in Washington, a shadow war was already being fought. A war of intelligence, of secrets, and of catastrophic failures to communicate. This was the world of magic. In one of the greatest intelligence coups of the war, American cryptanalysts had broken Japan's most secret diplomatic codes. Every day, a select group of men in Washington, including the President, the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Navy, and a few top intelligence chiefs, read the private diplomatic messages between Tokyo and its embassies around the world. They were inside Japan's head, and by late November 1941, the messages were screaming. On November 19th, a message went to Japanese consulates, including one in Honolulu, instructing them to report in meticulous detail the movements of ships in Pearl Harbor. The now infamous bomb plot messages divided the harbor into a grid and asked for updates on which battleships were where. This was not normal diplomatic traffic. This was tactical military reconnaissance. In Washington, this information was translated, analyzed, and then filed away. A key piece of the puzzle was recognized, but no one connected it for the man who needed it most. Then, On November 26th, the Japanese carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, slipped out of Hido-Kapu Bay under radio silence. Its course was set for Hawaii. That same day in Washington, a high-level war warning was drafted. It was sent to Kimmel and other Pacific commanders on November 27th. It is the document that would later be used to hang Kimmel. It famously began, "This dispatch is to be considered a war warning." But the devil was in the details it omitted. It stated that negotiations with Japan were over and that an aggressive move was expected within days. But where? The message instructed Kimmel to prepare for possible attacks in two directions: the Philippines, Tai or Kra Peninsula, or possibly Borneo. Not a single word mentioned Hawaii. Not a single word suggested his own base was the target. Kimmel was told to look south and west, while the true danger was bearing down on him from the north and east. Washington's focus was on Japan's southward expansion. The idea that Japan would dare attack the American homeland, thousands of miles from its own shores, while simultaneously launching campaigns across Southeast Asia, was seen as strategic madness. It was a failure of imagination at the highest levels, a failure that condemned the men at Pearl Harbor. Kimmel received this war warning and did what any reasonable commander would do. He prepared for the threats he was told about. He sent his one available carrier, the USS Enterprise, to deliver fighter planes to Wake Island, to the west. He was playing the hand he was dealt, based on the intelligence he was given, which was, deliberately or negligently, incomplete. The clock kept ticking. On December 6, 1941, the Magic Intercepts delivered the final, undeniable piece of the puzzle. It was a long, 14-part message from Tokyo to its embassy in Washington. It was Japan's formal reply to American demands, a document that severed all negotiations. Analysts worked through the night translating it. Parts of it were in the hands of senior officials, including President Roosevelt, by that evening. After reading it, Roosevelt turned to his advisor, Harry Hopkins, and said the words that should have triggered the highest alert: "This means war." Think about that moment. The President of the United States, holding the translated document in his hand, states unequivocally that it means war. What happens next in a functioning command structure? An urgent, top-priority flash warning is sent to every frontline commander, especially the one guarding the nation's premier fleet. The Pacific Fleet is put on the highest possible alert. Long-range patrols are scrambled, regardless of cost or wear on equipment. But that is not what happened. What happened was nothing. Roosevelt finished his day. He had a quiet dinner. He went to bed. And in a warm office in Washington, the final part of the Japanese message, the part instructing the embassy to deliver the rupture of relations to the U.S. Secretary of State at 1 p.m. Washington time the next day, was translated. A junior officer, Lieutenant Commander Alwyn Kramer, saw the significance of that 1 p.m. deadline. It was a precise time for breaking off relations. In military strategy, a precise diplomatic action often signals the start of a precise military action. Kramer and a few others felt a chill of realization. A warning message was drafted for the Pacific, but it was bogged down in bureaucracy, sent by a slow commercial telegraph, and most catastrophically, it was misrouted and delayed. It would not arrive in Hawaii until hours after the attack had begun. The final warning died on the desk of a telegraph clerk. Meanwhile, at Pearl Harbor, it was a quiet Saturday night. Admiral Kimmel attended a dinner party. He was concerned, vigilant based on the warnings he had, but not expecting an air raid the next morning. He had no reason to. He had been told to look the other way. Dawn on December 7th brought not warnings, but the sound of airplane engines. At 7:55 a.m., the first wave of Japanese fighters and bombers descended on the unsuspecting fleet. The battleships lined up on Battleship Row, just as the Japanese spy reports had detailed, were hit first and hardest. The USS Arizona exploded, a cataclysm that killed over 1,000 men in an instant. The Oklahoma rolled over and sank. The California, West Virginia, and Maryland were engulfed in flames and smoke. The airfields were strafed and bombed, destroying most of the aircraft on the ground. In less than 2 hours, the Pacific Fleet was devastated. 2,403 Americans were dead. 1,178 were wounded. 8 battleships were damaged or sunk. The horror was absolute. And in the midst of that hell, standing at the window of his headquarters at the submarine base, watching his world burn, Admiral Kimmel had a realization that cut through the shock. He turned to his aide, his uniform pristine as the chaos erupted around him, and uttered the words that would define the rest of his life. They knew. They knew they were coming. And they didn't tell me. The attack was over by 9:55 a.m. The cover-up began by 10:05 a.m. In Washington, the initial shock quickly curdled into a frantic search for survival, political survival. The American public was reeling, demanding answers. Someone had to be held responsible. The question in the corridors of power was not, how did our intelligence system fail, but whose head will roll to placate the public? Admiral Kimmel was the perfect candidate. He was on the scene. He was a military man, not a politician with powerful allies. He had been vocal about his needs, which made him inconvenient. And he had already been set up for the fall by the incomplete and misleading warnings sent to him. The narrative was crafted with swift, brutal efficiency. The commanders on the ground were asleep. They were complacent. They failed to connect the dots. The Washington officials who controlled the dots were only too happy to let that narrative stand. Within days, Kimmel and his army counterpart, General Walter Short, were relieved of their commands. Not suspended pending investigation, but publicly stripped of their duties in a wave of national disgrace. The newspapers crucified them. Cartoons depicted them as sleeping, blindfolded fools. They were tried and convicted in the court of public opinion before any official inquiry could begin. The first official investigations were exercises in containment. The Roberts Commission, convened within days of the attack, was a political tool. Its key witness? The very Washington officials whose actions, or inactions, were in question. Men like General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, and Admiral Harold Stark, the Chief of Naval Operations. The commission was not given full access to the magic intercepts. The existence of the broken codes was considered so sacred, so vital to the ongoing war effort, that it was deemed more important than the truth of Pearl Harbor. Kimmel and Short were denied access to this evidence, the very evidence that could exonerate them by showing what Washington knew and when they knew it. They were forbidden from cross-examining the Washington officials who had failed them. They were, in every sense, defenseless. The Roberts Commission report was a whitewash. It placed the blame squarely on Kimmel and Short for dereliction of duty and errors of judgment. It lightly criticized Washington for misunderstandings, but absolved the top leadership of any material fault. The scapegoats had been chosen, branded, and sacrificed. Kimmel was demoted from 4-star admiral to 2-star rear admiral, a crushing humiliation. He retired in shame shortly after, his career and reputation in ruins. He spent the rest of his life a broken man, carrying the weight of a national catastrophe that was not his fault. But the truth is a persistent thing. It could not be buried forever. The first cracks appeared even during the war. Military men who knew the details were sickened by the injustice. In 1944, a secret naval intelligence report, meant only for the eyes of top brass, concluded that the fundamental failure lay in Washington's inability to properly evaluate and disseminate the intelligence it possessed. The report was immediately classified and hidden. The real reckoning began after the war. As documents were declassified and historians pieced together the magic story, a shocking picture emerged. It became clear that Kimmel and Short had been starved of critical information. Investigators found the bomb plot messages. They found the records of Kimmel's repeated requests for resources. They found the damning timeline of the December 6th intercept and Roosevelt's "This means war" comment. Each discovery chipped away at the official narrative. But the most explosive revelation, the one that points not to failure but to a potential conspiracy, involves a single, cryptic signal. It was known as the Wines Execute message. In November 1941, as a failsafe, Japan set up a covert code to be broadcast in its international weather reports. Specific phrases would warn its embassies of a breakdown in relations with specific countries. The code for war with the United States and Britain was east wind, rain. Washington knew about this code. They were monitoring Japanese weather broadcasts around the clock, listening for those exact words. And according to multiple sworn testimonies given after the war by radio operators and intelligence officers, the message was heard. On or around December 4th, 1941, monitors at a U.S. listening post in the Pacific intercepted a Japanese weather broadcast that contained the phrase, Higashi no Kaze aim. East wind, rain. This was it. The final, unambiguous signal that war was imminent. The information was allegedly sent up the chain in Washington, and then it vanished. The officer who reportedly sent the confirmation claimed he was later pressured to change his story. The paperwork could never be found. Did this message, this final proof, ever reach the president? Did it reach the chief of naval operations? If it did, and no warning was sent to Pearl Harbor, the failure moves from tragic negligence to something far darker. If it didn't, it represents a breathtaking breakdown in the very intelligence system Washington was so keen to protect. This is the cliffhanger of history. This is the ghost that haunts the Pearl Harbor story. The wind's message is the bridge between incompetence and conspiracy. Its disappearance is the black hole at the center of the cover-up. Admiral Kimmel died in 1968, a broken man never officially vindicated. But his family did not give up. His sons, and later his grandsons, took up the fight. For decades, they have petitioned the U.S. government, Congress, and the Pentagon to clear his name. They have demanded a posthumous restoration of his 4-star rank, a symbolic act admitting the historic wrong. They have been backed by historians, by retired admirals and generals, and by the simple, mounting weight of declassified evidence. Yet, again and again, the Pentagon and successive presidential administrations have refused. The official reason is always the same. The old investigations have been reviewed, and their findings stand. But the unspoken reason is perhaps more powerful. To fully exonerate Kimmel is to indelibly inculpate the revered establishment of World War II Washington. It is to admit that the great President Roosevelt, the iconic General Marshall, were presiding over a system that failed catastrophically and then sacrificed 2 loyal officers to hide that failure. It is to tarnish the good war narrative. The reputation of the institution, it seems, is still deemed more valuable than the truth or than justice for one man. So, the question hangs in the air like smoke over Battleship Row. Was it a failure? Or was it a fix? We have seen the setup. We have seen the betrayal. We have seen the scapegoat destroyed. But who, specifically, made the decision to let that final warning die? Who burned the memo? Who silenced the witness? Our investigation leads us to a small, cramped radio listening station on the west coast of the United States in early December 1941. The men here are intercept operators, sworn to secrecy, listening to the crackling airwaves of the Pacific. One of them is a young sailor named Ralph Briggs. Decades later, in the safety of retirement, Briggs would tell his story to historians. He was on duty the night of December 4th, 1941. His assignment was to monitor Japanese weather broadcasts for the wind's execute code. And that night, he heard it. Clear as day. The announcer read the phrase, Higashi no Kaze aim. Briggs knew its meaning instantly. He logged the intercept, filled out the priority report, and sent it up the chain to Washington, to the Office of Naval Intelligence. He did his duty. And then, he was told to forget it ever happened. After the attack, officers from Washington visited his station. They collected logs. They debriefed the staff. The official line became that no authentic winds execute message was ever received. Ralph Briggs's report, and others like it from stations in the Philippines and Hawaii, vanished from the record. But Briggs was not the only one. In Washington, the message landed on the desk of Lieutenant Commander Alwyn D. Kramer, the Navy's top Japanese language expert and the man in charge of distributing the magic intercepts. Kramer would later testify, under oath in a closed-door congressional investigation in 1945, that he saw a report confirming the winds execute message had been broadcast. He prepared a special bulletin, a winds execute alert, for distribution to senior officials. But then, something strange happened. His superior, Captain John R. Bertel, the president's own naval aide, intervened. According to Kramer's later, hesitant testimony, Bertel told him the message was not authentic, or that it was not to be distributed. The bulletin was killed. The warning was stopped at the desk of the president's own aide. Why? Was it a judgment call? Was it orders from higher up? Or was it the first act of containment? This brings us to the heart of the conspiracy, the actions and inactions in the White House and the War Department in the 72 hours before the attack. The more mainstream, yet still damning, explanation is simpler: criminal negligence and a subsequent political fix. The top tier of the U.S. government, Roosevelt, Marshall, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Chief of Naval Operations Harold Stark, were guilty of an unforgivable failure. They possessed the greatest intelligence advantage in modern history, magic, and they fumbled it completely. They failed to interpret it correctly. They failed to connect the dots between the bomb plot, messages, and Hawaii. They failed to send clear, unambiguous warnings. Their failure cost 2,400 lives and nearly cost America the Pacific Fleet. To admit this after the fact would have been politically catastrophic. It would have destroyed public confidence in the very leadership tasked with winning the war. It could have triggered congressional investigations that paralyzed the government. In the grim calculus of wartime, sacrificing 2 military commanders in Hawaii, Kimmel and Short, was seen as the lesser evil. It contained the scandal. It gave the public its villains. It allowed the war machine in Washington to continue functioning without facing accountability. The scapegoats were not chosen out of personal animosity, but out of cold political necessity. It was a sacrifice play on the grand chessboard of history. And Kimmel was the pawn designated to fall. But a pawn with a family. And this is where our story moves from the corridors of power to the living rooms of a family shattered by history. Admiral Kimmel's son, Manning Kimmel, served as a submarine commander in the very war his father was blamed for starting. He lived with the dual burden of fighting for his country while his father's name was spat upon by it. After the war, Manning and his brother, Thomas, began the long, lonely fight. They gathered documents. They hired historians. They petitioned the Navy, the Department of Defense, and Congress. Their demand was simple and devastating in its symbolism. Restore our father's 4-star rank. Posthumously promote him. Admit, officially, that he was not solely to blame. They were met with a wall of bureaucratic silence, a fortress of institutional pride. The Navy's official boards of inquiry, reviewing the case again in the 1990s and early 2000s, repeated the same mantra. While Kimmel and Short were not solely responsible, they bore a measure of responsibility. The language was always careful, always designed to share the blame just enough to keep Washington's portion from being the majority. The Pentagon refused the family's request. Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama all declined to intervene. The torch then passed to the grandchildren. Edward R. Kimmel, the admiral's grandson, became a tenacious advocate. He framed the argument not as an attack on FDR or General Marshall, but as a simple plea for justice. He was not provided the intelligence that was available in Washington. Kimmel would state plainly in interviews. He was set up to be the fall guy. The family's fight gained powerful allies. Senator Strom Thurmond championed their cause. In 1999, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution, unanimously, exonerating Kimmel and Short and calling for their ranks to be restored. It was a monumental moment. But a Senate resolution is not a command. The Pentagon, the keeper of the institution's flame, simply ignored it. Then, in 2021, a shocking breakthrough seemed to occur. A memo from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, dated September 2021, was sent to Congress. It stated that after a thorough review, the department had determined that Admiral Kimmel's 4-star rank should indeed be posthumously restored. The Kimmel family was ecstatic. Headlines announced the historic vindication. But within days, the Pentagon backtracked. A spokesman called the memo a mistake. It was premature. The review was not complete. The door of justice, opened for a fleeting moment, was slammed shut again. The message was clear. Even 80 years later, the institution would not yield. The cost of admitting this truth was still deemed too high. Why? Why is the name husband Kimmel still so dangerous? The answer lies in what we choose to remember and what we need to forget. World War II is America's good war. It is the foundational myth of modern American power and morality. Franklin D. Roosevelt is a secular saint, the leader who guided the nation through depression and war. General George Marshall is the architect of victory and the noble mind behind the Marshall Plan. To fully, unconditionally exonerate husband Kimmel is to shatter that stained glass window. It is to show that these icons presided over a system that was not just flawed, but corrupt. It is to show that in their first great test of the war, they failed utterly, and then conspired to hide that failure behind the broken lives of 2 loyal officers. It forces us to rewrite the very first chapter of America's greatest story, not as a tale of heroic awakening after a surprise attack, but as a tale of gross incompetence and cynical betrayal at the highest levels. The truth about Pearl Harbor is not a single fact. It is a spectrum. On one end, simple, tragic human error. On the other, a deliberate, malicious conspiracy. The weight of evidence pulls us away from the extremes and into a dark, uncomfortable middle ground. It was not a plot to get America into war, but it was also not an unavoidable surprise. It was the result of a bureaucracy drowning in its own secrets, of leaders failing to lead, of a culture of arrogance in Washington that dismissed threats to the periphery. And then, in the aftermath, it became a conscious, coordinated effort to protect the institution by destroying the men on the ground. That is not an accident. That is a crime. The crime of the perfect scapegoat. Admiral Husband Kimmel was not a hero. He was a tough, conventional officer placed in an impossible situation. But he was not the villain. He was the victim. His story is the shadow side of the greatest generation. A reminder that even in a righteous war, the first casualty is often the truth, and the last to receive justice are those sacrificed for the sake of the narrative. The ghost of the winds execute message still haunts us because it represents the path not taken. It represents the warning that could have sounded, the alarm that could have been raised, the lives that could have been saved. Its disappearance is the original sin of the Pearl Harbor story. And until the United States government finds the courage to face that sin, to utter the name Kimmel without flinching and restore what it took from him, that ghost will never be laid to rest. The cover-up, it seems, is the one part of the Pearl Harbor operation that was executed with flawless, enduring efficiency.